macroscopic level, they exist to kill. They travel, they attack, they hide, they even gather together in defense maneuvers. Pathogens are the enemies of every member of the healthcare team. On Pathogens and PPE, we give you the tools you need to fight these threats and win. So sit back, tune in, and let's make these microbes tremble at the sound of your name.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Pathogens and PPE podcast. This is episode 6, all about IP auditing and sterile processing. I'm Jill Holdsworth, manager of infection prevention at Emory University Hospital Midtown in Atlanta, Georgia. And I am joined in the studio today with my friend and prior colleague, Paul Gentile. Paul, why don't you introduce yourself?
Thank you, Jill, and it's nice to be back on this podcast series with you. Hi, everybody. I'm Paul Gentile, and I'm a former infection preventionist from Emory University Hospital Midtown. So I'm an infection preventionist at Yale New Haven Hospital in New Haven, Connecticut.
Awesome. Don't go anywhere. We will be right back with some tips and tricks for auditing. Hey everyone, we are here with episode 6 of the Pathogens and PPE podcast. We are going to be talking all about auditing by the infection prevention team in sterile processing today. And Paul and I have some really cool guests with us today. They are podcast experts. We have Frankie and Jake here today. So Frankie, why don't you go ahead and tell everybody a little bit about who you are?
Hi, and I'm so happy to be back. My name is Frankie Catalfumo. I'm an infection preventionist at Inova Health System. So I'm also an IP, and I do have my sterile processing certificate, so a little bit of a double threat, if you will.
Awesome. And Jake?
Hey, I'm Jake McHugh. I am a process improvement auditor for Agility and big infection control advocate. I've been in the industry for 15 years.
Awesome. So let's start off with just kind of some softball questions here, just to get us started talking about auditing, and then we'll get into more of the harder to talk about things as far as IP audits go. So let's start with Frankie. What would you say would be one of the most important things to audit on a routine basis would be in sterile processing?
I would have to say the thing that I look for the most is any sort of pre-cleaning done by our ORs, because that's where we start really setting up SPD for success. So making sure our instruments free of any blood or any bioburden. So I always work with the teams to kind of start looking at that process and realizing where things can be further improved to set SPD up for success.
No, and Frankie, I think you made up a great point. I think pre-cleaning, it really is something that we really need to focus on in SPD and also at the front lines as well, because it inhibits like the formation of like bacteria and biofilms that can start forming in minutes once we use one of those instruments.
Absolutely for pre-cleaning, because it's at the start of all those instructions for uses that everybody has, and we all have to follow the rules when we're reprocessing those instruments.
And Jake, what about you as far as auditing goes? I've seen a lot of the auditing tools that you guys use on a regular basis. What would you say is one of the most important or one of the ones that you use most often when you're rounding on your teams that you work with?
So it can really depend on what area we're going through. If I'm going through SPD, I'm probably looking at the surgical tray audit checklist. So I'm just going through the process. I'm watching staff kind of assemble trays, inspecting trays. What tools are they using? Whether that's magnifying lenses, microscopes, tracking systems, to make sure that they can not only inspect the instruments, but if they don't know what to do, how are they going to tackle that? But probably my more favorite one is the flexible endoscope reprocessing checklist, because a lot of that is based around cleaning, post-procedure, pre-cleaning, decontamination, high-level disinfection, and a lot of things can also go back into damage. So whenever they damage a flexible scope, it's an excellent space for bacteria or other nastiness to hide and potentially contaminate.
No, and Jake, and I think you bring up a great point too, like with the auditing. I think, it's very important that in terms of the audits that we do, and especially with the flexible endoscopes, monitoring quality and compliance is paramount. And I think that's something that is very important that we accomplish in SPD with IP.
Now let's pretend for a second that somebody listening thinks, wow, those things sound super great to audit, but I don't have any of those tools. I don't have anything to start from. What can I do to start doing things on my own? And I've had a lot of people that come to me and say that. And if they don't have somebody to just send them an audit tool to copy off of, where could somebody start if they want to start auditing on their own? Jake, I'll start with you.
I mean, they can obviously reach out to their infection control specialists at their hospital. If they're partners with Agility, or they can reach out to us and we can send them all the information they want.
And someplace I would also throw in there is looking at the IFUs, print them out, look them over really quickly, and then go to your colleagues and be like, hey, I'm not the expert, but you are. Can you at least teach me? And then kind of use the IFU like a checklist. It's super nitty gritty, but as long as you start getting the basics, it can help you become more familiar, and then a semi-expert / forever a sidekick for them, because that's what I think we are for SPD. Everyone is a sidekick for their success.
Yeah, and Frankie and Jake, I must say that, you both touched on important pieces. I think, IP is definitely the one to go to. If you don't know, an IP can always be a guide for the SPD folks in terms of following the IFUs. And I think from a regulatory standpoint, they definitely always want us referencing back to IFUs.
I've actually done that before, Frankie, where you take the IFU and you just use it. You take papers, you print them out, you take them, and you go follow the process. And one of my favorite things to do, if you have the time, is to take it from the start of when the instruments get put out for the case, and you follow it all the way through the case, all the way through sterile processing to when it gets put back up in sterile storage. And that's really cool to me. It really teaches you a lot. It has you looking at things you never thought you would look for. It gets you really familiar with IFUs. We've also taken IFUs for scopes and literally turned it into an audit checklist, and just taken every step of it and made it into a checklist and said, did you do this part? Yes or no? And then we turn it back into the endoscopy department and said, this is how compliant you are. And that is kind of a tough pill to swallow sometimes, because the departments don't realize that they aren't following the IFUs, or that the IFUs are so difficult, or they're different for every scope. So I do recommend doing that, but it does take a little bit of time, but it's a great way to start if you don't have anywhere else to start.
Absolutely. And I love that you touched back on how not everything is exactly the same. I've been going through a lot of departments, and different models, even different generations, can have the reverse of steps, flushing instead of suctions, different brushes, different steps for the manual cleaning process. And it can be a real nightmare.
You bring up a really good point, and I'm going to kind of do a double whammy here. Is I say, go ahead and start from start to finish, and then try to set that up the next day, so that way you're a little bit more comfortable. And if there's any deviations, ask why. Why are you using a different brush? Why are you doing this instead? And that way it begins to kind of build your expertise to understand the nuances and differences between some of these brands and between some of the ways that we clean things.
That's a really great suggestion. And the more that we ask questions, the more we learn as IPs, the more that sterile processing technicians can get involved in the processes, and the more we partner together. And I think all of this is really great to work together on. And that's what we're all here for, right? Auditing doesn't have to be an I gotcha moment. It doesn't have to be a survey. It really is something that we should be collaborating on, even though the word audit sounds really negative and scary sometimes. And we probably should come up with a different word for it that sounds fun and positive. But sometimes we are the IPs and we're coming and they see us coming to do a audit or checklist or something. And all of a sudden everybody's busy and no one wants to talk to us. So that's the exact thing that we're trying to avoid. So let's move on to a new question. When you're reading the IFU, what do you do when you feel like the IFU maybe doesn't have all of the information that you're looking for? And I'll start with you, Jake.
So the number one thing I would do is I would call back the company and see if they have any further information. Sometimes they may have additional paperwork that goes into the details, or they may even have multiple versions of that IFU for the same device. I'm just picking away at them. I've called up plenty of vendors for that information.
Yeah, and Jake, I think you bring a really great point. I think, the IFUs may not always be clear and there needs to be further interpretation from it. So I think going straight back to the representative from the manufacturer is probably the best idea to do instead of going to someone else.
And I'm going to flip the question around a little bit and ask Frankie. I know there are a lot of things that we look at that have very onerous IFUs. So what happens when you feel like the IFUs actually can pose a safety risk because of how difficult they are? Any suggestions on what we can do in that instance?
I think this is where the IP partnership becomes really critical overall, because we can help advocate even for additional resources or additional help to go ahead and help them better understand how to do that, and maybe go to that manufacturer and see if there's any wiggle room or anything equally as safe, or getting them the resources they need to stay safe when they reprocess this equipment. If it is quite taxing and it does require a lot of time, maybe advocating for, spacing out the procedures so that way they're not back to back and you have to reprocess them. Use your IP as backup, because your IP will absolutely back you up, because our goal is to prevent actively and not retroactively, because it's less work. An ounce of prevention.
Yeah, I think trying to stay on the preventative track is the most important, Frankie. So I think, it's very important that we still continue to be multidisciplinary and really advocate for those departments too, because we may be their only voice too.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to switch gears now. One of my favorite types of rounding and auditing is environmental rounding. And this is really important in sterile processing because there are a lot of things that seem to just never get fixed in sterile processing and go on and on forever. You've got ceiling tiles that seem to always be stained, or holes in the wall, or you have floors that need replaced. So again, if you're the sterile processing person who's listening today, or even the IP who just hasn't gotten to rounding, where do you start? How do you know what to look for? What are the big ticket items that we need to be on the lookout for in sterile processing? And Frankie, I'll start with you on this one.
I tend to go towards general cleanliness. If you walk into SPD, especially on the clean prep and pack side, and you see dusty vents, I would be alarmed. If this is the place where we're about to send things right before sterilization and right before patient care, that's pretty much where I start focusing, and then I go ahead and reverse track. So I'll start on the clean side, and then I'll go ahead and maybe check out sterile storage as well. How are these things living until they are actually used? And then follow all the way through decon. You probably know a little bit enough to be dangerous when you go in there. Just use what you know and then move from there. Is there any dust? Is there any rust? Is there anything that you wouldn't want in your house of SPD, really?
Yeah, Frankie, I think that's a great point. I think sterile processing, especially the prep and pack side, that's where we keep all these sterile instruments. We have to protect the integrity of these instruments too. So it's really important from an environment of care perspective that, we are looking at some of those items you mentioned. I also think of water intrusions as well, making sure that those types of things don't occur in that space that could potentially compromise any of those instruments that may be in there.
Jake, how about you? What do you look for in the environment? I know you have a keen eye for things that are going on in the environment when you round.
So the first things I look for when I walk into a department is make sure that they have hand washing capabilities, because I want to wash my hands when I'm walking in. So whether they got sinks or they have foam on the walls. The next thing I'm going to be looking for are sterile tray integrity. So making sure that there's no wrap trays in sterile storage that are disintegrating or they have torn tape or popped arrows. And that's just my kind of immediate observation. And then I might go over to one of the technicians and just start asking them, not necessarily what should the temperature and humidity be, but where would you find that information? Do they know where to go to see if it's within compliance? And just kind of follow the trail from there to the manager, to environmental services, or whoever might be over that.
So Jake, you're kind of like doing almost like a tracer. You're looking for specific items. I agree with you. Hand hygiene, looking at alcohol-based hand rubs, making sure that's readily available and accessible. And then also just understanding the scenario and just kind of following through their workflow processes, I think is really important too.
And the term tracer may not be something that everyone is familiar with, but when we use the term tracer, it's following sometimes we use it in terms of a patient. So following the patient through their entire journey. So in sterile processing, it would be a little bit different, but like Paul mentioned, it would be following someone through their normal workflow through the entire process, since it's not necessarily a patient situation. It's the actual flow of the work. And so that's where we trace a process. And so we call it a tracer. So now I'm going to switch gears and just kind of talk about what best practices in auditing are. And I love talking about this because I've heard so many different stories through the years of people who have done this really well, and also IPs who maybe could use a little bit of work on partnering with their sterile processing group. So I want to talk about what can help this go well and how we can nurture that collaborative relationship when IPs are coming into audit, and giving advice that can benefit both sides, whether you're the SPD side, whether you're the IP side. How can we make sure we're working together when these audits happen? And I'll give you an example to get us started. When I've presented before, I've heard that IP comes in, they have their clipboard, they write down some stuff, they look around, they don't talk to anybody, and then they leave. No one ever hears anything about what they found, and they're never heard from again. So, in case you weren't wondering, that's not how to do it. So we want to make sure that IP is a good partner and that SPD is an engaged partner in this process so that everybody's working together. So, Jake, why don't I start with you? What do you think some good tips for those that are listening would be on both sides to be engaged and to foster collaboration?
So for one thing, if there's somebody wandering around in my department that I don't recognize, I'm going to probably inquire to who they are and just in a friendly manner, just see what they're doing. Maybe they need some assistance walking out of the department. They got lost. But as soon as I find out that they're infection control, I want to see if they have any questions about what they're looking for. Is there anything I should be aware of? And try to engage them as much as I can, because maybe they're looking for a specific part of the department and they just haven't made it there yet.
Yeah, and I agree, Jake, too. I think, we should look at the IPs as a resource. And I like how you have that questioning attitude as well, because we know many people walk through sterile processing. So I think it's very important to kind of figure out who's in there and what are they there for and what's their purpose.
I actually love that answer. If you see anybody that doesn't work in the department, especially somebody you don't know, which honestly, hopefully you do know your IP. If you're listening to this and you don't know who your IP is, go find them and introduce yourself or ask them to come down for a visit. But of course, if you don't know who's walking into your facility, absolutely you should approach them and say, can I help you? And, hopefully they have on the right PPE and ask them how you guys can work together. But also, if the IP is coming in and they're coming around and they do so on a regular basis, our ultimate goal would be that you come to us. And it takes a while to get there. But my favorite thing is going into the department now and having people say hi, or they come to you and they say, oh, can I come show you this? We have this thing going on, or I want to show you what we're working on. That is the best feeling to me. And the only way that that's going to happen is if you spend time down there more than just when you go to audit. So you actually have to hang out down there a little bit, get to know the people. So that would be my advice, is spend as much time down there as you can and really get to just know the work, just observe. Don't always go down when you need to get your audit in for the month. Frankie, how about you? What would your advice be?
So from my IP side of the brain, I actually love going up to people and making sure I know their names. Names go so very far. That way, if you're bumping into them in the cafeteria, you're like, hey, Jill, hey, Paul, hey, Jake. It just really starts making it more of a friendship, and it's easier to be friends with your SPD members. So that way they can show you those things. You can walk in and be a familiar face. And then something that I do if I'm sort of unfamiliar as well, I say, hey, I'm new to this area. My name's Frankie. What's yours? Am I wearing the appropriate PPE? It automatically gives them an opportunity to flex their muscles to let them know I'm in their house, and then help them let them know, like, I don't know everything you do. Am I appropriately dressed to be in this area? Can you show me a few more things that you really know about? Like, break the ice. You're not the expert, they are, but you shortly can be.
Yeah, I think it's very important, Frankie, to not be a stranger to them, but be a friend. And, we're all in it together. I know that's a common saying that we heard quite frequently these last couple of years. But I think, I think in SPD and infection prevention, we all have the same mission and vision of what we expect. And we all want to protect our patients, and we want to make sure we're doing the right thing in the end. So I think that's a really good point.
Exactly. And for those in SPD who are brave enough, it's worth it to go up to the infection control department and meet those team members, learn from them, and possibly even offer to give them a tour of your department. Go up there and bring them down, because the more they're down there, the more they're going to see, the more they're going to be able to help your department. And especially if you're aware of certain things that are out of bounds regulatorily, that you can use them as a backup to kind of push for those changes you need.
Yeah, Jake and Jill, you can probably attest to this too. I cannot stand sitting behind a computer, and I'm sure that, it's very nice to go on these field trips to see different ancillary departments too and what they do. So that's the only way how we can really help and establish those relationships.
Yeah, and I really loved that, Jake. I would absolutely love it if somebody from Sterile Processing came up here and said, hey, would you guys like to come down and visit us? I think that would be amazing. So I really encourage people to do that. If your IPs haven't been down to your department, I would absolutely love to hear those stories. And the IPs would probably love it, because sterile processing doesn't come easy to a lot of IPs. So it's not natural for IPs to just walk in somewhere and say, I have no idea what you do. Can you teach me? So invite them down there. Something that we have done here that Paul and I did too was we would just go and observe and learn and ask questions. We wouldn't be auditing anything. We would just go and stand beside the person that was doing the work. We would link up with one person who was a lead, and they would be the teacher. And that was so empowering to them. And I really encourage people to do that in their departments. And I also wanted to say, Frankie, I love what you said too about really giving the person in sterile processing kind of that ownership of the space. I think that a lot of times what I hear from those that work in SPD, they don't feel like they have the power to speak up. They're not empowered to say, like, this is my house and you can't do this or you can't do that. So really showing them that, yes, I am an IP, but I am not the expert in this place. I have just entered your house and I want you to teach me. I think that is so great and kind and just a really great way to start off a collaborative relationship where there isn't a superior and inferior. Like, we're all on the same page. We're all learning from each other. And just reminding them of that they are the expert in this and that we need to learn from them, I think starts the relationship off really well. And as we start to wrap up this episode, this has been a really great discussion. So thank you guys for your input. Just want to kind of do a round robin and see if you have any last words or last pieces of advice. Paul, I'll start with you.
I think we definitely, Jake and Frankie, thank you so much for being on this podcast. And I think, we touched on some very important pieces. I think it's very important that we establish relationships with our SPD and infection prevention folks and really be advocates for one another. And we all have the same goals in mind. I love how you guys touched on the instructions for use, always going back to that and also to the manufacturer. I also like to, at the beginning, we were talking a lot about pre-cleaning because that is one of the most important steps. And I know that's constantly under scrutiny with regulatory bodies. So I think these were all great points that you touched on today.
Awesome. Jake, any last pieces of wisdom?
So if I could give one final, word of wisdom, I guess, is for everybody to go back to their Amy ST79 documents, not saying you got to read the whole thing right now, but particularly there were some amendments that came out in 2020. And one of them was about environmental services, food, drink, and some other stuff for the department environment. Review that and partner up with your infection control team to make sure you're in compliance with that. It's a great amendment in that regulation book.
In my sage advice, if you're looking for a pro tip how to break the ice, ask your SPD manager, can you join Huddle? Join every single day. Start to get to know their names. Start to become a familiar face. This is a great way to lower the anxiety that your position may bring on the team. So just join their Huddle. All you got to do is say hi, soak it in, learn what they're learning, ask questions, allow them to be the experts. Huddles are such a great way to break the ice, whether it be SPD or a new area that you're covering as an IP. Pro tip, free pro tip.
Free advice from Frankie. Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for being on this episode, and we will see you next time for episode 7. Thanks.
Just to recap what we talked about in this episode, we did touch upon pre-cleaning and the importance of doing that prior to going into decontamination. And we also talked about following the instructions for use, and as tedious as they can be, it's very important that we follow them. And if we don't understand what is being stated in the IFUs, to reach out to the manufacturers and also collaborate and establish a relationship with infection preventionists. I think that's the most important thing because, again, we're a resource to the hospitals or any type of healthcare facility you're working in. So I think it's very important that we are continuing to establish that friendship and relationship with them to help them through any problems they may have.
We also emphasize the importance of spending time together in sterile processing, whether you're from SPD or you're from IP. Initiate that conversation and that relationship to really spend the time observing an SPD, observing the process, looking at the IFUs, and really following the process along, and using that as your start to auditing if you need somewhere to start. If you're an SPD and you aren't sure how to get an audit started, contact your friends in IP and just start learning about the environmental things that you can start looking for every day. You don't have to do a formal audit to look at your environmental auditing strategies. So partner together, collaborate together, and be engaged in the process together. That's it for today, and we'll see you next time. Don't forget to wash your hands and keep fighting dirty.
Thanks for tuning in to this exclusive podcast series on pathogens and PPE. For more information and clinical resources to help you fight dirty, make sure to follow us on social media by searching for Beyond Clean and Transmission Control.